We economic hitmen really have been the ones responsible for creating this first truly global empire. And we work many different ways. But perhaps the most common is that we will identify a country that has resources our corporations covet, like oil, and then arrange a huge loan to that country from the World Bank or one of its sister organizations. But the money never actually goes to the country. Instead, it goes to our big corporations to build infrastructure projects in that country, power plants, industrial parks, ports, things that benefit a few rich people in that country, in addition to our corporations, but really don't help the majority of the people at all. However, those people, the whole country is left holding a huge debt. It's such a big debt they can't repay it, and that's part of the plan, that they can't repay it. And so at some point, we economic hitmen go back to them and say, listen, you owe us a lot of money, can't pay your debts, so sell your oil real cheap to our oil companies. Allow us to build a military base in your country, or send troops in support of ours to someplace in the world like Iraq, or vote with us on the next UN vote. To have their electric utility company privatized and their water and sewage system privatized and sold to U.S. corporations or other multinational corporations. So there was that whole mushrooming thing, and it's so typical of the way the IMF and the World Bank work, that you put a country in debt, it's such a big debt it can't pay it, and then you offer to refinance that debt and pay even more interest. And you demand this quid pro quo, which you call a conditionality or good governance, which means basically that they've got to sell off their resources, including many of their social services, their utility companies, their school systems sometimes, their penal systems, their insurance systems, to foreign corporations. So it's a double, triple, quadruple whammy. And in that way, we've really created an empire, but we've done it very, very subtly. It's clandestine. All the empires of the past were built on the military, and everybody knew they were building them. So that the British knew they were building them, the French, the Germans, the Romans, the Greeks, and they were proud of it. And they always had some excuse, like spreading civilization, spreading some religion, something like that. But they knew they were doing it. We don't. The majority of the people in the United States have no idea that we're living off the benefits of a clandestine empire, that today there's more slavery in the world than ever before. And then you have to ask yourself, well, if it's an empire, then who's the emperor? Obviously, our presidents of the United States are not emperors. An emperor is someone who's not elected, doesn't serve a limited term, and doesn't report to anyone, essentially. So you can't classify our presidents that way. But we do have what I consider to be the equivalent of the emperor, and it's what I call the corporatocracy. The corporatocracy is this group of individuals who run our biggest corporations, and they really act as the emperor of this empire. They control our media, either through direct ownership or advertising. They control most of our politicians because they finance their campaigns, either through their corporations or through personal contributions that come out of the corporations. They're not elected, they don't serve a limited term, they don't report to anybody. And at the very top of the corporatocracy, you really can't tell whether a person's working for a private corporation or the government, because they're always moving back and forth. So, you know, you've got a guy who one moment is the president of a big construction company like Halliburton, and the next moment he's vice president of the United States, or the president who is in the oil business. And this is true whether you've got Democrats or Republicans in the office. You have them moving back and forth through the revolving door. And in a way, our government is invisible a lot of the time, and its policies are carried out by our corporations on one level or another. And then again, the policies of the government are basically forged by the corporatocracy and then presented to the government. They become government policy. So it's an incredibly cozy relationship. This isn't a conspiracy theory type of thing. These people don't have to get together and plot to do things. They all basically work under one primary assumption, and that is that they must maximize profits regardless of the social and environmental costs.
This process of manipulation by the corporatocracy through the use of debt, bribery, and political overthrow is called globalization. Just as the Federal Reserve keeps the American public in a position of indentured servitude through perpetual debt, inflation, and interest, the World Bank and IMF serve this role on a global scale. The basic scam is simple. Put a country in debt either by its own indiscretion or through corrupting the leader of that country, then impose conditionalities or structural adjustment policies, often consisting of the following. Currency devaluation. When the value of a currency drops, so does everything valued in it. This makes indigenous resources available to predator countries at a fraction of their worth. Large funding cuts for social programs. These usually include education and healthcare, compromising the well-being and integrity of the society, leaving the public vulnerable to exploitation. Privatization of state-owned enterprises. This means that socially important systems can be purchased and regulated by foreign corporations for profit. For example, in 1999, the World Bank insisted that the Bolivian government sell the public water system of its third largest city to a subsidy of the U.S. corporation Bechtel. As soon as this occurred, water bills for the already impoverished local residents skyrocketed. It wasn't until after a full-blown revolt by the people that the Bechtel contract was nullified. Then there is trade liberalization, or the opening up of the economy through removing any restrictions on foreign trade. This allows for a number of abusive economic manifestations, such as transnational corporations bringing in their own mass-produced products, undercutting the indigenous production and ruining local economies. An example is Jamaica, which, after accepting loans and conditionalities from the World Bank, lost its largest cash crop markets due to competition with Western imports. Today, countless farmers are out of work, for they are unable to compete with the large corporations. Another variation is the creation of numerous, seemingly unnoticed, unregulated, inhumane sweatshop factories, which take advantage of the imposed economic hardship. Additionally, due to production deregulation, environmental destruction is perpetual, as a country's resources are often exploited by the indifferent corporations while outputting large amounts of deliberate pollution. Furthermore, a cursory glance at the performance record of the World Bank reveals that the institution, which publicly claims to help poor countries develop and alleviate poverty, has done nothing but increase poverty and the wealth gap, while corporate profits soar. In 1960, the income gap between the fifth of the world's people in the richest countries versus the fifth in the poorest countries was 30 to 1. By 1998, it was 74 to 1. While global GNP rose 40% between 1970 and 1985, those in poverty actually increased by 17%. While from 1985 to 2000, those living on less than $1 a day increased by 18%. Even the Joint Economic Committee of the U.S. Congress admitted that there is a mere 40% success rate of all World Bank projects. In the late 1960s, the World Bank intervened in Ecuador with large loans. During the next 30 years, poverty grew from 50% to 70%. Under or unemployment grew from 15 to 70%. Public debt increased from $240 million to $16 billion, while the share of resources allocated to the poor went from 20% to 6%. In fact, by the year 2000, 50% of Ecuador's national budget had to be allocated for paying its debts. It is important to understand the World Bank is, in fact, a U.S. bank supporting U.S. interests, for the United States holds veto power over decisions, as it is the largest provider of capital. And where did it get this money? You guessed it, it made it out of thin air through the fractional reserve banking system. Of the world's top 100 economies, as based on annual GDP, 51 are corporations, and 47 of that 51 are US-based. Walmart, General Motors, and Exxon are more economically powerful than Saudi Arabia, Poland, Norway, South Africa, Finland, Indonesia, and many others. And, as protective trade barriers are broken down, currencies tossed together and manipulated in floating markets, and state economies overturned in favor of open competition and global capitalism, the empire expands.
You get up on your little 21-inch screen and howl about America and democracy. There is no America. There is no democracy. There is only IBM and ITT and AT&T and DuPont, Dow, Union Carbide, and Exxon. Those are the nations of the world today. We no longer live in a world of nations and ideologies, Mr. Beale. The world is a college of corporations, inexorably determined by the immutable bylaws of business. The world is a business, Mr. Beale.
Wide, wonderful world of new forms, newly proportioned for you forms. Oh, beautiful, wonderful, beautiful, wonderful, beautiful, wonderful new world of forms.
I have asked Robert McNamara to assume the responsibilities of Secretary of Defense, and I'm glad and happy to say that he has accepted this responsibility. Mr. McNamara leaves the presidency of the Ford Company at great personal sacrifice.
What do you believe that will cost you? More than I like to say. There will be profits foregone of approximately $3 million during the next 3 to 4 years.
Robert McNamara was a very, very significant player in all of this. And of course, in a way, he represents the corporatocracy, because the corporatocracy is composed of 3 pillars: the heads of big corporations, the heads of big banks, and the heads of government. McNamara represents it from the fact that he was president of Ford Motor Company, private sector, big corporation, and then he became Secretary of Defense under Kennedy and Johnson.
Representatives in Saigon met with representatives of the South Vietnamese government. They jointly agreed that joint retaliatory action was required.
The Viet Cong, the communists, have lost 89,000 men killed in South Vietnam.
Thousands of demonstrators opposed to the Vietnam War assembled in the nation's capital for a mass protest. For the most part orderly, minor scuffles did occur between the demonstrators and hecklers.
Robert McNamara, when he was Secretary of Defense, was there during a great deal of the Vietnam War. And he saw the futility of trying to expand empire through the military.
For many long and quite demanding years, Bob McNamara has guided the defense establishment. He has helped to give America the most efficient military strength in its history. In this intensely loyal, brilliant, and good man, America is giving to the world, and if I may be personal, I am giving the world the very best that we have to win the most important war of all.
He really made the World Bank into what it is today. When he entered the World Bank, it was lending about $900 million a year. When he left in 1981, it was lending $12.5 billion a year. And then he was the one who really made poverty alleviation the bank's mission. It was McNamara who really came out with these very typically American sort of missionary statements about we have to be our brother's keeper, you know, and help the poor and all this. And he really inspired people at the bank. They thought, well, this is just a, you know, we have a real mission, you know. You know, it's sort of like Wolfowitz bringing democracy to the world. And
I appreciate the world leaders taking my phone calls as I explain to them why I think Paul will be a strong president of the World Bank. I've said he was a man of good experiences. He helped manage a large organization. The World Bank's a large organization. The Pentagon's a large organization. He's been involved in the management of that organization. He's a skilled diplomat. And Paul is committed to development. He's a compassionate, decent man who will do a fine job in the World Bank.
I believe deeply and passionately in the mission of the World Bank. The opportunity of working to lift 1 billion people who earn less than $1 a day out of poverty and billions of others who live in circumstances of poverty, to give them a fair chance in life is an exciting responsibility and a real challenge. One thing that has impressed me a lot as I've traveled around the world is not only that the poorest countries of the world need and value the relationship with us, but even the very successful developing countries still find a benefit from working with the World Bank.
Evil folks still lurk out there.
Our goal is to defend the American people, eliminate Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, to secure Iraq's oil fields, liberate the Iraqi people.
Liberate the people of Iraq, people whose lives we care about. The day of freedom is drawing near.
And then the Empire spoke again, and it tried to drown our voices in the deafening violence of war. There could have been no clear statement of global public opinion, and they went to war anyway. We marched together and rallied and campaigned, and everywhere we felt out the edges of this system. The illusions of stability, economic efficiency, and representative democracy were replaced with crisis, war, and terror, with war as terror.
President Bush has promised to rid the world of evil and to lead the great mission to build free societies on every continent. To understand such an epic lie is to understand history. Hidden history, suppressed history, history that explains why we in the West know a lot about the crimes of others, but almost nothing about our own. The missing word is empire. The existence of an American empire is rarely acknowledged, or it's smothered in displays of jingoism that celebrate war, and an arrogance that says no country has a right to go its own way unless that way coincides with the interests of the United States. For empires have nothing to do with freedom. They're vicious. They're about conquest and theft and control and secrets. Since 1945, the United States has attempted to overthrow 50 governments, many of them democracies. In the process, 30 countries have been attacked and bombed, causing the loss of countless lives.
In my lifetime, the following countries in Latin America have been assaulted by the United States, directly and indirectly. Their governments replaced by dictators and other pro-Washington leaders.
precedent for economic hitmen really began back in the early 50s when democratically elected Mossadegh, who was elected in Iran, he was considered to be the hope for democracy in the Middle East and around the world. He was Time Magazine's Man of the Year. But one of the things that he'd run on and began to implement was the idea that foreign oil companies needed to pay the Iranian people a lot more for the oil that they were taking out of Iran. The Iranian people should benefit from their own oil. Strange policy. We didn't like that, of course. But we were afraid to do what we normally were doing, which was to send in the military. Instead, we sent in one CIA agent, Kermit Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt's relative. And Kermit went in with a few $1 million and was very, very effective and efficient. And in a short amount of time, he managed to get Mossadegh overthrown and brought in the Shah of Iran to replace him, who always was favorable to oil. And it was extremely effective.
Mobs overflow Tehran. Army officers shout that Mossadegh has surrendered and his regime as virtual dictator of Iran is ended. Pictures of the Shah are paraded through the streets as sentiment reverses. The Shah is welcomed home.
So back here in the United States, in Washington, people looked around and said, wow, that was easy and cheap. So this established a whole new way of manipulating countries, of creating empire. The only problem with Roosevelt was that he was a card-carrying CIA agent, and had he been caught, the ramifications could have been pretty serious. So very quickly at that point, the decision was made to use private consultants to channel the money through the World Bank or the IMF or one of the other such agencies, to bring in people like me who worked for private companies, so that if we got caught, there would be no governmental ramifications. The United States has been involved in this empire-building process since approximately the end of World War II, but most of it has been done secretly. It's been done by economic hitmen like me. CIA agents don't call themselves spooks or spies, and they don't usually even call themselves CIA agents. They're the commercial attaché or the political attaché at a US embassy or something. They put some other official title. It's not usually spy or even CIA agent. And it is the same with us. It's an economic hitman is a generic term, and but it's not one that you don't put on your business card. We economic hitmen worked in many different ways, but probably the most typical way was that we would identify a country, like a third world country, that had resources that our corporations want, such as oil. And then we would arrange a huge loan to that country from an organization like the World Bank. But most of the money would go directly to some US construction company or other contractor, such as a Bechtel or a Halliburton. And those companies then would build huge infrastructure projects in this third world country, like power plants, industrial parks, ports. When Charles T. Main had a contract with the government, my job was to inflate the need as high as I could, make the loan as big as I could, and this was, in essence, a policy. But the whole country would be stuck holding a huge debt. A debt so large that it couldn't possibly repay it. So at some point, we economic hitmen would go back to that country and say, look, you can't repay your loan, so do us a favor. Vote with us on the next critical United Nations vote, or send troops in support of ours to someplace in the world like Iraq, or most importantly, sell your oil to us real cheap, or your labor pool, or some other resource that we want.
Political apartheid ended in 1994. Nelson Mandela and the ANC were swept into power in South Africa's first democratic elections. But victory was not so simple or so easy. A year earlier, while negotiating the transition to democracy, the ANC signed its first World Bank loan and began a program of structural adjustment. The new constitution was the most progressive in the world, guaranteeing the human right to water, housing, and electricity. But under the influence of the IMF, the ANC privatized all three, creating 8 million homeless in South Africa and cutting off water and electricity to tens of thousands of families every month. The apartheid state was defeated, but nothing changed. The economy was still in the hands of the same global system.
This is a farm. South Africa's a farm. And the whites were the farm managers. Now they've been kicked out. Now we've got black farm managers. Same motherfuckers. Same minds. Same greed. Different color. This is a lick of paint. It's the haves and the have-nots. It's always been the haves and the have-nots. Simply put, the Americans, Germans, Canadians, who had so much invested in keeping us miles under the ground, digging our gold and diamonds, they found out that their shares were at risk, right? Because the mine workers were organizing themselves. And so they went to the ANC, who's been in bed with the communists for all that time, and they says, are you willing to manage our business? What's your business? South Africa. And they said, sure. So now our government is, in fact, the farm managers. I'm a field nigger. You see? South Africa's a farm.
Why is this? That's the freedom. We want the freedom that our people died for.
This is our democracy that our children, our mothers, our daughters, our sons died for. Let us go and defend this democracy.
In the previous struggle, you could identify the enemy. It was the Boer, the apartheid, it was the system. But now, for the ordinary person in the street, the enemy are difficult to identify. Because we're not fighting a world system here that has just been thrown upon us.
As soon as one of these presidents is elected, he's immediately visited by an economic hitman. Someone who looks a lot like me walks into their office and he says, look, Mr. President, I'm here to congratulate you on being president. And he says, in this pocket, I've got $200 million for you and your family if you play the game our way. And in this pocket, I've got a gun to shoot you with if you decide to fulfill your campaign promises. The decision is yours, but I want to remind you, remember Salvador Allende, remember Arbenz, remember Patrice Lumumba, remember, there's a whole list of them. And these presidents all know, they know what happened to those people. Anyone that went up against the corporatocracy either died or got taken out of office. So what would you do in a situation like that? You know, I think we all have to ask ourselves, what would I do if I was in that situation? It's very, very difficult. We looked at Saudi Arabia as our biggest success as economic hitmen, and probably the one that, in the long run, has had the most impact on world history for a long time.
The king sees the oil development as the greatest single means to modernize his country and improve the living standards of his people. The Navy has has said that Saudi Arabian oil is one of its most important strategic sources of supply.
Back in the 70s, we were facing this oil crisis. OPEC had decided to basically hold us hostage to them. And the Treasury Department came to me and other economic hitmen and said, you know, we can't allow this to happen anymore. We can't be blackmailed by OPEC. You guys have to figure out a way to stop this. And we knew that the key to any such solution lay with Saudi Arabia, because we knew that the House of Saud was corruptible and Saudi Arabia had more oil than anybody else in the world. And so we worked out this deal with Saudi Arabia, whereby the House of Saud would guarantee that the price of oil would stay within limits reasonable to us, and we'd guarantee that the House of Saud would stay in power.
So what we agreed to do was not investigate Saudi Arabia, not condemn it, not look into it if it would pump oil. It was a gentleman's agreement. You will not find a piece of paper. But it was always understood.
Now, in the case of Saudi Arabia, in the long run, there was what we call blowback. It's a CIA term. It means that a policy that you think has worked to your advantage ultimately blows back in your face.
If 15 of the suicide bombers on 9/11 were Saudis, right? How many Saudis have been indicted, have gone to jail for 9/11? None.
When the economic hitmen fail, the next step is what we call the jackals. Jackals are CIA-sanctioned people that come in and try to foment a coup or revolution. If that doesn't work, they perform assassinations or try to. Ecuador, for many, many years, had been ruled by pro-U.S. dictators, often relatively brutal. Then it was decided that they were going to have a truly democratic election. Jaime Roldos ran for office, and his main goal, he said, as president, would be to make sure that Ecuador's resources were used to help the people. And he won, overwhelming, by more votes than anybody had ever won anything in Ecuador. And he began to implement these policies to make sure that the profits from oil went to help the people. Well, we didn't like that in the United States. I was sent down as one of several economic hitmen to change Roldos, to corrupt him, to bring him around, to let him know, you know, okay, you know, you can get very rich, you and your family, if you play our game, but if you continue to try to keep these policies you've promised, you're going to go. He wouldn't listen.
He was a man who wanted Ecuador to go its own way. He wanted the indigenous people to not have these U.S. oil companies come in and pollute the area and so forth. He was a very enlightened guy, not particularly radical. He was a good man. I mean, we liked him. We thought he was one of the better presidents in Latin America.
En la época de Roldos se duplicó el salario de los trabajadores y hasta la época no se ha vuelto a recuperar la capacidad adquisitiva que tenían los trabajadores en el año 80.
Jaime Roldos was in favor of a hydrocarbons act that protects the oil of Ecuador and makes sure that the Ecuadorian people get a fair share of the profits of the oil that's taken up.
Una de nuestras principales riquezas es el petróleo. El petróleo constituye hoy el filón principal de la riqueza ecuatoriana.
Definitivamente, si uno ve los últimos meses de su mandato, básicamente desde enero fundamentalmente, encuentra muchos hitos de presión. Constantemente parece que recibía amenazas, recibía papeles que simplemente leía, rompía y tiraba, ¿no? Y aparentemente eran muchas amenazas contra ellos. Mi mamá estaba preocupada.
Seguiremos defendiendo, como hemos defendido, la no intervención y la libre determinación de los pueblos. Y saludamos con beneplácito los avances democráticos que hacen los pueblos del mundo. Procuramos una América Latina más unida, más fuerte y más solidaria. Probemos el amor a la patria, cumpliendo cada quien con nuestro deber. Nuestra gran pasión es y debe ser el Ecuador. Nuestra gran pasión, oídeme, es y debe ser el Ecuador. ¡Viva la patria!
After the plane crash, the whole area was sealed off, and not even Ecuadorian police were allowed into it. The only people allowed into it were U.S. military personnel and some very higher echelon Ecuadorian military personnel. Local police officers were not allowed in. A couple of very, very key people who were going to testify during the hearings later that it was an assassination died in car crashes in Ecuador. These are Ecuadorians.
Hubo mucha prisa por parte del gobierno que asumió el mando de cerrar el caso. Se hizo un informe en menos de una semana. Una semana. Y en una semana tenían listo el informe y dijeron que era un accidente.
Served an incredible notice on any future presidents of Ecuador. So when the economic hitmen go in and say, here's a couple of $100 million for you and your family, or if you don't take that, here's a bullet. The temptation is to say, well, look, I'll go along with it because maybe I can do something good, and in the meantime, I'll get rich, and my family will get rich, and nobody's going to do any better than me.
Más del 50%. Más del 50% del presupuesto se orientaba al pago de la deuda externa. Durante todo ese periodo fue una espada de Damocles. Fue el chantaje continuo con el que los organismos impusieron las políticas, organismos internacionales, me refiero al Fondo Monetario, el Banco Mundial, impusieron políticas muy antipopulares. La dolarización fue un gran atraco, fue un gran robo nacional.
I was working in Panama with Omar Torrijos as an economic hitman. At the same time with your father, he was very nationalistic and a real populist, and he basically said no to the United States. He said, we're not going to do things your way anymore, which was rather shocking, I think, to Washington. And part of my motivation was I wanted to succeed with Omar Torrijos, and I wanted to succeed with your father, because for me it would save lives.
The thing is that when they died, for us was like the end of the world for my...
He said that Ecuadorian resources ought to be used to help the Ecuadorian people, not to make foreign corporations rich. And so we sent the jackals in to assassinate him.
Se dice claramente que en el caso de Torrijos, una pequeña grabadora dentro del avión en el que él viajaba tenía la bomba que estalla y que hace que ese avión caiga y muera Omar Torrijos.
Sí, esta es mi opinión, sí. Y también yo creo que casi algo parecido pasó con Jaime Roldós. Omar Torrijos, president of Panama, was, one of my favorite people. I really, really liked him. He was very charismatic. He was a guy who really wanted to help his country. And when I tried to bribe him or corrupt him, he said, look, John, he called me Juanito. He said, look, Juanito, I don't need the money. What I really need is for my country to be treated fairly. I need for the United States to repay the debts that you owe my people for all the destruction you've done here. I need to be in a position where I can help other Latin American countries win their independence and be free of this terrible presence from the north that you people are exploiting us so badly. I need to have the Panama Canal back in the hands of the Panamanian people. That's what I want. And so, leave me alone. Don't try to bribe me. It was 1981, and in May, Jaime Roldós was assassinated. And Omar was very aware of this. Torrijos got his family together and he said, I'm probably next, but it's okay because I've done what I came here to do. I've renegotiated the canal. The canal will now be in our hands. He just finished negotiating the treaty with Jimmy Carter. In June of that same year, just a couple of months later, he also went down in an airplane crash, which there's no question was executed by CIA-sponsored jackals. Tremendous amount of evidence that one of Torrijos' security guards handed him at the last moment as he was getting on the plane a tape recorder, a small tape recorder that contained a bomb.
Torrijos' language, his rhetoric, was suspiciously like that of Chavez or Allende, or very much like Jaime Roldós, by demanding that there be a canal treaty, that the treaty reverts, that the canal reverts to Panama, and that Panamanian sovereignty be respected.
He basically said no to the United States. He said, we're not going to do things your way anymore. This canal belongs to the Panamanian people. It bisects our country. We want it back, and we should have it back. This brought tremendous pride to Panamanians to have him say this. It changed their attitude tremendously. It increased their spirit.
The Panama Canal was a very strategic waterway. The dilemma of the United States is, will you allow this man to be in control of a strategic waterway?
Torrijos is a friend and ally of Castro, and like him is pro-communist. He threatens sabotage and guerrilla attacks on our installations if we don't yield to his demands. Well, the Canal Zone is not a colonial possession. It is not a long-term lease. It is sovereign United States territory, every bit the same as Alaska and all the states that were carved from the Louisiana Purchase. We should end those negotiations and tell the general, we bought it, we paid for it, we built it, and we intend to keep it.
A terrible burden for me that I knew that if I didn't really want to corrupt Torrijos because I admired his courage and his honesty and his determination to help his poor people. I admired that. On the other hand, it was my job to corrupt him, and I felt that if I didn't corrupt him, then the jackals would come in and something much worse would happen to him.
Good afternoon. This is a special news bulletin. Panamanian leader General Omar Torrijos Herrera has died. The 52-year-old strongman was killed when his Panama Air Force plane plowed into a mountainside during a pounding rainstorm in western Panama. His pilot and 5 other unidentified passengers were in the aircraft with him. There were no survivors.
When I learned that Torrijos was killed, I was devastated. I was very, very sad. Personally, I admired the man. He was fun, charismatic. I really liked him. And I was also terribly saddened for what it represented, for the symbolism that it deeply struck me that this is what my country does.
General Torrijos is the second Latin American president to die in a plane crash in the last 3 months. Ecuadorian President Jaime Robles
Now, of course,
died last
some
May.
maintain that these weren't just air crashes. These were political events that were staged. We have no proof. I mean, I don't know this for a moment, but it's not beyond belief that these were not natural acts. There have been lots of political plane crashes in Latin America. In fact, if you're a Latin American politician, take the train.
As I got deeper into that process, I was bribed and really threatened. If I talked to people, if I let the word get out that I was in the process of exposing what we had done, it became very clear to me that I would pay serious consequences. And at the same time, at one point, I was offered about $500,000 not to write the book. So I succumbed to this combination of bribes and threats. When Arbenz became president of Guatemala, the country was very much under the thumbs of United Fruit Company, the big international corporations. And Arbenz ran on this ticket that says, you know, we want to get the land back to the people. And once he took power, he was implementing policies that would do exactly that, give the land rights back to the people. United Fruit didn't like that very much. And so they hired a public relations firm, launched a huge campaign in the United States to convince the United States people, the citizens of the United States, and the press of the United States, and the Congress of the United States, that Arbenz was a Soviet puppet, and that if we allowed him to stay in power, the Soviets would have a foothold in this hemisphere. And that, at that point in time, was a huge fear on everybody's mind, the Red Terror, the communist terror. And so, to make a long story short, out of this public relations campaign came a commitment on the part of the CIA and the military to take this man out. And in fact, we did. We sent in planes, we sent in soldiers, we sent in jackals, we sent everything in to take him out, and did take him out. And as soon as he was removed from office, the new guy that took over after him basically reinstated everything to the big international corporations, including United Fruit.
In the 1950s, 2% of the population of Guatemala controlled the natural wealth in collusion with giant US corporations like the United Fruit Company, which dominated banana growing. On the board of United Fruit was John Foster Dulles, who happened to be US Secretary of State. His brother Alan happened to run the CIA. Both were Christian fundamentalists who regarded any opposition as the work of communism and the devil. In 1950, this man, Jacobo Arbenz, became the first Guatemalan leader to be democratically elected by a majority of his people, who saw in him the hope of social justice. He was the Hugo Chavez of his day.
What was going on in Guatemala is that there was a democratically elected president in 1950, Jacobo Arbenz, who sought to institute a series of New Deal-style reforms in which the state had a greater role in both developing the economy and redistributing wealth. And the centerpiece of that was a land reform.
Arbenz was far from radical. His land reform policies were modest. But Washington was having none of it. Howard Hunt was then working for Alan Dulles' CIA.
So they said a decision has been made at the highest levels of our government to rid Guatemala of the Arbenz regime, and we would like you to participate in it. You will be the chief of propaganda and political action.
In Guatemala, what the CIA did was mobilize every facet of American power. It didn't just isolate Guatemala militarily and diplomatically, but it used the techniques of social psychology in a nearly year-long campaign which created a sense of crisis in Guatemala.
What we wanted to do was have a terror campaign to terrify Arbenz particularly, terrify his troops, much as the German Stuka bombers terrified the population of Holland, Belgium, and Poland at the onset of World War II.
And that's what they did, so that the United States could control the economy of Guatemala, destroying the dreams of its people.
We sowed confusion through the countryside. And of course, by this time, we had aircraft flying over and dropping leaflets and doing a little harmless bombing.
A little harmless bombing and a CIA terror campaign cost thousands of lives. Arbenz, the Democrat now branded a communist, was humiliated, stripped naked, and photographed before being forced into exile. Richard Nixon, then Vice President of the United States, flew in to congratulate the new dictators.
That Guatemala is going to enter a new era in which there will be prosperity for the people together with liberty for the people.
General Rios Montt was to be one of Washington's faces of liberty. During his time as president in the 1980s, thousands of people were murdered by death squads, most of them indigenous men, women, and children. His guns and helicopters came from the United States. President Reagan flew in to warmly endorse the general, whom he described as a man of great personal integrity.
In the CIA, we didn't give a hoot about democracy. I mean, it was fine if a government was elected and would cooperate with us, but if it didn't, then democracy didn't mean a thing to us. And I don't think it means a thing today.
This is Santiago, the capital of Chile. In 1973, the National Stadium was turned into a concentration camp as a military coup, backed by the United States, overthrew the democratically elected government of Salvador Allende. The leader of the coup was a fascist, General Augusto Pinochet. For the invisible people of Latin America, Chile under Allende became an inspiration. In Washington, President Nixon secretly plotted to destroy the Chilean economy. "We're going to make the economy scream," said Nixon. In Santiago, General Pinochet, America's man, sent in his British-made bombers against the presidential palace. It was September the 11th, 1973, a date that held an infamy and irony 28 years later.
My wife and our children were at the house, and they had a marvelous view of these planes winging over and then dipping down and sending their bombs into the Moneda.
From inside the palace, Allende refused to leave, true to his promise not to surrender the government for which the ordinary people of Chile had voted. He broadcast this last message, then he shot himself.
Trabajadores de mi patria, tengo fe en Chile y su destino. Sigan ustedes sabiendo que mucho más temprano que tarde, de nuevo, abrirán las grandes alamedas por donde pase el hombre libre para construir una sociedad mejor. ¡Viva Chile! ¡Viva el pueblo! ¡Vivan los trabajadores!
With General Pinochet in power, Washington again denied it had destroyed another democracy.
We had no contact with any of the people that carried out the military coup, and therefore the coup that overthrew Allende was done without contact with the United States.
A very different story is told by these secret documents. In October 1970, the CIA cabled its man in Chile. It is firm and continuing policy that Allende be overthrown by a coup. When that happened 3 years later, a US official cabled back to Washington. Chile's coup d'etat was close to perfect. By the late 1980s, Washington's policy changed. Dictators like Pinochet were seen as an unnecessary embarrassment. A new and innovative way of controlling nations was launched.
Good morning and welcome. It's good to have you all here to help celebrate the launching of a program with a vision and a noble purpose. The National Endowment for Democracy is, just as we've been told, more than bipartisan. The establishment of the National Endowment goes right to the heart of America's faith in democratic ideals and institutions. It offers hope to people everywhere.
Like any new brand, it had a snappy name, Democracy. It was largely fake, an illusion of marketing and spin. This brand of democracy meant that whoever you voted for, the policies would be broadly the same, and your country's economy would be in step with the United States. Washington would be your closest friend, or else. In the 1990s, these democracies in name replaced dictatorships in Latin America, with Chile providing the model. This is the commercial center of Santiago, Chile. On the surface today, everything seems normal, modern, prosperous. To the Bush administration, Chile is the very model of economic success. A laboratory experiment, according to the magazine Business Week. Much of life has been privatized. There are now billionaires, and the rich are getting richer.
Pinochet fixed the country.
Who says? The United States says.
No. The World Bank says, the Inter-American Bank says, everybody says it. He brought about an economic miracle in Chile. And I'm saying he had the brains for it, but he had the brains to hire all these people, Chileans, who had studied at the University of Chicago, who knew something about real economics.
Real economics were advocated by Milton Friedman, an extreme right-wing economist at the University of Chicago. Friedman was invited to perform his laboratory experiment on the economic life of Chile. The families of the tortured and disappeared were silent witnesses. Without irony, he called his experiment shock treatment.
Please be seated. Well, thank you all very much. It's an honor for me to be here to pay tribute to a hero of freedom, Milton Friedman. He has used a brilliant mind to advance a moral vision. We have seen Milton Friedman's ideas at work in Chile, where a group of economists called the Chicago Boys brought inflation under control and laid the groundwork for economic success.
This is the other side of the economic miracle. Chile today is a deeply unequal society. This shanty town is just minutes from Santiago's smart hotels.
Hay tantos cesantes, hay miles de cesantes, los jóvenes, y el que trabaja no alcanza para nada. ¿Y con qué paga la luz? ¿Con qué paga el agua? Hay que comprar el gas, todas las cosas que hay que comprar. Diariamente la mamá dice, ¿qué hago para la comida de los niños? ¿De dónde saco dinero?
We found this couple living and freezing in the shantytown. They're homeless and have a week-old baby.
Si usted puede describir un poco cómo es vivir en estas condiciones.
Para empezar, el frío en la noche.
Difícil.
El frío en la noche es súper difícil. Por mi guagua tuvimos que prender la cocina.
¿Cuánta gente en Chile vive de esta manera? En realidad,
yo creo que mucha gente.
Y en peores condiciones que nosotros. Pero hay gente que simplemente no recibe ayuda porque nomás, porque no hay ayuda. ¿A dónde se van a ir entonces?
A la calle. Vamos a dormir en la calle otra vez, pues ya
hemos dormido en la calle. En el extranjero, en Europa y en Estados Unidos y en otros lugares, se dice que Chile tiene una reputación como un país rico, acomodado. Sí. ¿Qué es lo que ustedes dicen a eso? Sí, yo creo que sí.
Es verdad, pero para la gente que...
Pero eso es para la gente que tiene, no para nosotros.
Chile is a democracy now, in theory. A complicated voting system splits the vote and discourages real reform. It's a product of General Pinochet, based on a constitution that's also a product of Pinochet. The general may be dead, but the power of the military remains. It's all very modern, the media is safe, and many believe it's wise to be silent, like the graves of their forgotten compatriots. It's Washington's ideal democracy.
La dictadura tuvo un gran éxito en Chile desde el punto de vista de que estableció un modelo político, económico y social que todavía permanece hasta el día de hoy, porque en esencia no se ha cambiado la Constitución que impuso la dictadura en 1980.
No, nosotros no perseguimos democracia porque esa palabra está tan manoseada que no se entiende. Aquí hay una persecución contra los pobres, y no es en Chile, en toda América Latina está pasando eso. Yo creo que la gente que estudia sabe que ese punto de seguir así va a reventar en alguna cosa eso. Yo pienso que el pueblo va a despertar y va a decir, basta, ¿hasta cuándo?
And if they fail too, then as a last resort, we send in the military.
We come to Iraq with respect for its citizens, for their great civilization, and for the religious faiths they practice. We will deliver the food and medicine you need. Do not destroy oil wells, a source of wealth that belongs to the Iraqi people. The government of Iraq and the future of your country will soon belong to you.
We provided Saddam Hussein with a great deal of money and weapons. In fact, we brought Saddam Hussein into power. We lent him billions of dollars. We built chemical plants for him, knowing full well that these chemical plants were being used to produce chemical weapons that would be employed against the Kurds and the Iranians. But we continued to support this man. And the economic hitman went in and tried to convince him to accept a deal similar to what the Saudis had accepted.
One of the signs that the relationship wasn't working was when Bechtel tried to get a pipeline built, working with Saddam Hussein, that would bring Iraqi oil out of the port of Aqaba, Jordan, and Bechtel would build this oil pipeline. And Saddam Hussein said no, and the fact that he said no to this huge deal was one of the signs that this guy isn't going to play ball as we want him to.
Now, had he accepted that deal, he'd still be president, but he didn't. I'm not sure why. Maybe just stubborn, maybe crazy. I don't know why he didn't accept, but he didn't. And so we sent in the jackals.
We had a series of CIA teams. I was head of one of them to go in and actually see if we could do a coup d'etat. I mean, when we went in, we walked across the border. We got in touch with military officers in January 1995 who said, yes, we can do a coup d'etat. The plan went forward, and the plan included taking a tank company, surrounding Saddam's residence in Aujaz, a small city, forcing him to resign, arresting him or killing him.
But it didn't work. Assassinating Saddam was a big risk. He had too many doubles, too many lookalikes. His own bodyguards didn't know whether they were guarding him or somebody else.
شكرا أشكر الدولة زنكين
And so we sent the military in, the last resort. You got the economic hitmen. When they fail, the jackals go in. If they fail too, then as a last resort, we send in the military.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, the great men and women who wear the uniform of the United States have already accomplished amazing things in Iraq, but their work is not done. We owe it to these noble Americans, to their Iraqi and coalition partners, and indeed to ourselves and to the world, to finish the work that they have so nobly advanced.
Wolfowitz. Paul Wolfowitz is the one man who has spent the largest percentage of his adult life trying to figure out how to unseat Saddam Hussein.
So we sent in the military, and we did take him out.
They've essentially done what the U.S. tries to do through the World Bank, which is to restructure economies in a way that favors the interests of multinational corporations. That's the game. Here, they've taken off the velvet glove and used the iron fist in a way that is much more blatant.
I appreciate the world leaders taking my phone calls as I explain to them why I think Paul will be a strong president of the World Bank. I've said he was a man of good experiences. He helped manage a large organization. World Bank's a large organization. The Pentagon's a large organization. He's been involved in the management of that organization. He's a skilled diplomat. And Paul is committed to development. He's a compassionate, decent man who will do a fine job in the World Bank.
I believe deeply and passionately in the mission of the World Bank. The opportunity of working to lift 1 billion people who earn less than $1 a day out of poverty and billions of others who live in circumstances of poverty, to give them a fair chance in life is an exciting responsibility and a real challenge.
They're basically economic hitmen, you know. They spent $20 billion out of Iraq's money in this unbelievably wasteful and unaccountable fashion, and now Iraq has trouble financially and, in fact, you know, is in debt, and that's very convenient for the U.S. government, because in order for Iraq to get credit and investment or IMF support, there are certain conditionalities, and one of those conditionalities is privatize your oil.
The International Monetary Fund signed an agreement with the Iraqi government in December 2005 for the cancellation of part of Iraq's external debt. And one of the conditions set by the International Monetary Fund was that the Iraqi government pass a law by the end of 2006. That law shifts the Iraqi oil industry from being in the public sector, which has been the case for nearly 35 years in Iraq, to being predominantly controlled by multinational companies.
So the way that it went is, okay, we will give you a structural adjustment program, okay? You liberalize, you deregulate, you privatize your economy, okay? As the quid pro quo, and the money that we give you will then be channeled into debt repayments to our commercial banks.
Yes. It sounds like the same old scenario, and empires have always been built that way. It's just that this one has been done a little bit more secretly up until now. What's interesting, I think, about Iraq in a way is that things are really coming out in the open.
Do you, Pentagon, promise to make war without end on countries that defy the civilized world by refusing to integrate with the global market economy?
I do.
Do you, World Bank, promise to continue forever and ever with policies such as water privatization, free trade, and labor deregulation?
I do, most definitely.
With the power vested in me by the President of the United States and by the U.S. Treasury and Defense Departments, I now pronounce Pentagon and World Bank husband and wife. May the invisible hand of the free market bless their union. You may invade, dictate, and impoverish now.
So it's an amazingly clever scheme, because the lines for tracing it were very hazy. These private companies are paid by the government, but they're paid under these misleading contracts. So for instance, Charles T. Maine was hired to do economic hitman work, but is considered engineering feasibility studies or economic feasibility study, and there was no direct connection. And of course, the other interesting thing is the money, we didn't even have to get the money that we loaned the countries. We got it through the World Bank. We'd set up an organization that was there to provide the money to do this. So we didn't need to provide it. Our own government, the United States government, didn't have to provide it, except we'd provide some to the World Bank. So we didn't even have to put up the money. And in that way, we've managed in the last 30 or 40 years to build the world's first truly global empire. And we've done it primarily without the military, primarily through economic hitmen. You can go to places like Bolivia or Nigeria or Indonesia. You can go all over the world to very poor countries, and you can talk to people who may be illiterate, can't even read the newspapers, but they know that their country has just accepted a huge loan from the World Bank, and they can look and see that big American corporations are in there building huge projects, power plants, and they know the electricity is not going to come to their little cardboard shacks on the canals of Jakarta, Indonesia, or to their little campesino farms in the countryside of Colombia or Bolivia or Ecuador. They know they're not going to benefit.
You know, 100 years ago, there would be debt repayment crises in places like Venezuela and so on. And the US and Germany and France would send in gunboats to collect the debt. So this is, in a way, it's a very old story. Now it's the IMF and the World Bank. We don't need the gunboats or the troops. You send in the IMF and the World Bank to collect the debt.
Mr. Wolfowitz, welcome to Guatemala. Very nice to meet you. It's an honor to meet you.
My honor. I mean, there's no mafia on earth that has leverage like that.
the world is being taken over by a handful of business powers who dominate the natural resources we need to live while controlling the money we need to obtain these resources. The end result will be world monopoly, based not on human life, but financial and corporate power. And as the inequality grows, naturally more and more people are becoming desperate. So the establishment was forced to come up with a new way to deal with anyone who challenges the system. So they gave birth to the terrorist. The term terrorist is an empty distinction, designed for any person or group who chooses to challenge the establishment. This isn't to be confused with the fictional Al-Qaeda, which was actually the name of a computer database for the US-supported Mujahideen in the 1980s. In 2007, the Department of Defense received $161.8 billion for the so-called global war on terrorism. According to the National Counterterrorism Center, in 2004, roughly 2,000 people were killed internationally due to supposed terrorist acts. Of that number, 70 were American. Using this number as a general average, which is extremely generous, it is interesting to note that twice as many people die from peanut allergies a year than from terrorist acts. Concurrently, the leading cause of death in America is coronary heart disease, killing roughly 450,000 each year. And in 2007, the government's allocation of funds for research on this issue was about $3 billion. This means that the US government in 2007 spent 54 times the amount for preventing terrorism than it spent for preventing a disease which kills 6,600 times more people annually than terrorism does. Yet, as the name terrorism and Al-Qaeda are arbitrarily stamped on every news report relating to any action taken against US interests, the myth grows wider. In mid-2008, the U.S. Attorney General actually proposed that the U.S. Congress officially declare war against the fantasy. Not to mention, as of July 2008, there are now over 1 million people currently on the U.S. terrorist watch list. These so-called counterterrorism measures, of course, have nothing to do with social protection, and everything to do with preserving the establishment amongst the growing anti-American sentiment both domestically and internationally, which is legitimately founded on the greed-based corporate empire expansion that is exploiting the world. The true terrorists of our world do not meet at the docks at midnight or scream Allah Akbar before some violent action. The true terrorists of our world wear $5,000 suits and work in the highest positions of finance, government, and business. So, what do? How do we stop a system of greed and corruption that has so much power and momentum? How do we stop this aberrant group behavior which feels no compassion for, say, the millions slaughtered in Iraq and Afghanistan, so the corporatocracy can control energy resources and opium production for Wall Street profit?
By the late 70s, most of Latin America was controlled by dictators, including those like Pinochet, who were openly fascist. All of them were backed, directly and indirectly, by the United States. They sent their henchmen to be trained here at the School of the Americas in Georgia. Officially, it was described as little more than a Boy Scout camp, teaching American values such as respect for human rights. In fact, from these manuals were taught interrogation and torture techniques. Major Joseph Blair taught at the School of the Americas in the early 1980s.
The doctrine that was taught was that if you want information, you use physical abuse, you use false imprisonment, you use threats to family members, you use virtually any method necessary to get what you want.
Torture?
And killing.
Killing?
Killing. If there's someone you don't want, you kill them. If you can't get the information you want, if you can't get that person to shut up or stop what they're doing, you simply assassinate them, and you assassinate them with one of your death squad.
This is a death squad in action in El Salvador. Actually, it's the National Police, many of whom were trained at the School of the Americas. Here on the steps of San Salvador Cathedral, they're gunning down mourners attending the funeral of Archbishop Romero, who was murdered as he said Mass on March the 23rd, 1980. This man, Robert d'Aubusson, gave the order to kill the Archbishop. Major d'Aubusson was Washington's dirty secret in El Salvador. He was trained at the School of the Americas. According to the Truth Commission and a whole swathe of human...
well, come on, John. If this is where we're going, you're wasting my time. That's all bullshit. Those people all had agendas.
So it was bullshit that the Salvadorian military were murdering tens of thousands of people.
I bet you can't count more than 200 in the whole 10 or 12 years.
We can count 200 in this one village alone. They were mostly women and children, systematically murdered in just one day and night in December 1981 in the village of El Mazote. The killers belonged to a special battalion of the El Salvador Army, trained by the United States. There were few survivors.
Dijo que las mujeres se abrazaban llorando y gritando que no las mataran. Yo por estar peleando por mis hijos, no los quería dar, no los quería dejar yo, decía que me moriría con ellos. Pero me los quitaron de mis brazos. Cuando se oía que estaban matando a los niños por la noche, se oían los gritos de los niños y les gritaban a sus mamás y a sus papás.
You're taking the stuff from these propaganda mills. And I'm not interested.
What are the propaganda mills?
All these things, this truth thing and all that, they're nothing but propaganda mills.
Do you really think
I
they're...
didn't know so.
Are they all conning us, lying us? Yeah, Amnesty International?
Amnesty International's right in the middle of it.
During the 1980s, the years of Ronald Reagan in the White House, a trail of carnage and grief was blazed across Central America. I reported America's war against Nicaragua, which had the temerity to overthrow a Washington-backed dictator, Somoza. The CIA attacked Nicaragua with death squads known as the Contra. Why did Washington attack such tiny countries? Because the weaker they are, the greater the threat. People who can free themselves against all the odds are sure to inspire others. What right have you, when I mean you, the CIA, the United States government, or any foreign power, what right do you have to do what you do in other countries? What
National
right?
security interests.
But that's a divine right, isn't it? Because the people that you do it to have no say in this.
Yeah, well, that's just tough. We are going to protect ourselves, and we're going to go on protecting ourselves because we end up protecting all of you. And let's not forget that.
Right. Right? No, I won't.
We'll intervene whenever we decide it's in our national security interest to intervene. And if you don't like it, lump it. Get used to it, world. We're not going to put up with nonsense. And if our interests are threatened, we're going to do it.
Dices que otro Ecuador estás buscando, que nuestros compatriotas no estén emigrando. No hace mucho tiempo que esto no pasaba en mi nación, por eso sé que tú vas a ganar. Vota por el mejor.
Hay compromisos nacionales urgentes y nosotros primero pondremos los compromisos nacionales a los compromisos internacionales. En buena hora, si podemos cumplir ambos, pero nuestras prioridades son muy claras. Primero, la vida antes que la deuda.
Ο Ισημερινός θα μπορούσε να είναι μία από τις πλουσιότερες χώρες της Νότιας Αμερικής. Από τη στιγμή όμως που ανακαλύφθηκε πετρέλαιο, η χώρα γνώρισε μόνο δικτάτορες, φτώχεια, συσσωρευμένο χρέος και οικονομικούς δολοφόνους. Το 1982 καταφθάνει στον Ισημερινό το Διεθνές Νομισματικό Ταμείο και μαζί μια επιτροπή σοφών που εκπροσωπεί τους μεγάλους πιστωτές. Ο Ισημερινός αναγκάζεται να δανείζεται όλο και περισσότερα για να αποπληρώσει παλαιότερες υποχρεώσεις του.
Era simplemente un pillaje permanente que el Ecuador pagaba a los países del norte. Para ponerles un ejemplo, durante toda la década del 80 y del 90, ¿no?, hasta el 2005, el servicio de la deuda representaba alrededor del 50% del presupuesto del Estado. Es decir, el orden del 3.000 a 4.000 millones de dólares anuales, ¿no? Mientras que para salud, el gasto de salud anual del presupuesto era apenas del 4%. 4.000 millones para pagar el servicio de la deuda, 400 millones para gastos de salud. 4.000 millones para pagar el servicio de la deuda y 800 millones para educación, ¿no? Entonces estábamos matando a nuestra población.
Ο Ισημερινός εξεγείρεται. Η κρίση φαίνεται προς στιγμή να ελέγχεται όταν αναλαμβάνει ο Λούτσιο Γκουτιέρες, ο οποίος υπόσχεται κοινωνικές παροχές. Παρουσιάζεται σχεδόν σαν σοσιαλιστής, αλλά μόλις αναλαμβάνει καθήκοντα, κλείνει νέα συμφωνία με το Διεθνές Νομισματικό Ταμείο και επιβάλλει μέτρα εξοντωτικής λιτότητας. Οι πολίτες αποφασίζουν ότι πρέπει να φύγει, με το ίδιο μέσο μεταφοράς που χρησιμοποιούσαν και οι πρόεδροι της Αργεντινής, με ελικόπτερο. Ο αντιπρόεδρος Παλάσιο, που αναλαμβάνει την εξουσία, ξεκινά με καλές προθέσεις. Σύντομα όμως υποκύπτει στην Ουάσιγκτον και ο λαός στρέφεται στο μοναδικό πολιτικό που είχε αντισταθεί στις διεθνείς πιέσεις, τον Ραφαέλ. Ο Κορέα έχει σπουδάσει οικονομικά στην Ευρώπη και στις Ηνωμένες Πολιτείες και γνωρίζει πολύ καλά πώς μπορείς να αντιμετωπίσεις την Παγκόσμια Τράπεζα και το Διεθνές Νομισματικό Ταμείο αν έχεις την πολιτική βούληση.
C'était en 2005, quand il était ministre des Finances, Rafael Correa a dit ce n'est pas normal que le supplément de revenus pétroliers qui arrive dans les caisses du pays reparte entièrement au remboursement de la dette. C'est injuste pour la population. Et il a dit 80% des revenus pétroliers doivent être destinés à améliorer les dépenses sociales dans l'éducation, dans la santé, dans la création d'emplois. Et seul 20% doit aller dans le remboursement de la dette. La Banque mondiale a dit il n'est pas question que nous continuions à prêter de l'argent à l'Équateur si l'Équateur maintient une telle loi. Donc c'était clairement une immixtion de la Banque mondiale dans les affaires intérieures de l'Équateur. Et ce ministre, Rafael Correa, a dit il n'est pas question que j'accepte, moi comme ministre, cette imposition de la Banque mondiale. Et donc il a préféré démissionner plutôt que de plier devant la Banque mondiale. Ça l'a rendu extrêmement populaire. Les gens ont dit, ah voilà quelqu'un qui préfère démissionner et perdre son poste de ministre, mais pour défendre la dignité et l'intérêt de la population.
Ο Κορέα τελικά εξελέγει πρόεδρος το 2006. Μία από τις πρώτες αποφάσεις του ήταν να απελάσει τον εκπρόσωπο της Παγκόσμιας Τράπεζας και να ζητήσει από τους εκπροσώπους του Διεθνούς Νομισματικού Ταμείου να φύγουν από το κτίριο της Κεντρικής Τράπεζας. Στελέχη του Ταμείου, όπως ο Μπομπ Τρά, που αργότερα θα έρθει στην Ελλάδα, είχαν ήδη χαρακτηριστεί ανεπιθύμητοι από τους πολίτες του Ισημερινού.
La burocracia internacional majadera, incompetente y deshonesta tendrá que respetar a nuestro país. Así que por eso hemos expulsado al representante del Banco Mundial en el país y nos reservamos el derecho de iniciar las acciones legales pertinentes por los daños y perjuicios causados al país. Además, nos reservamos el derecho de calificar como ilegal las deudas que tenemos con el Banco Mundial.
6 μήνες μετά, ο Κορέα προχώρησε ένα βήμα παρακάτω. Ικανοποίησε το αίτημα των κοινωνικών οργανώσεων για επιτροπή λογιστικού ελέγχου.
Moi, j'ai été une des personnes désignées par le président Correa pour faire partie de cette commission. Il y avait 18 membres de la commission et il y avait aussi 4 organes de l'État qui étaient représentés dans cette commission. Et nous étions chargés d'auditer, donc d'analyser tous les contrats qui avaient entraîné l'endettement du pays entre 1976 et 2006. Nous avons travaillé 14 mois et nous avons analysé les dettes de l'Équateur sous la forme de bons. Nous avons analysé les dettes à l'égard du Fonds monétaire international, de la Banque mondiale et d'autres organismes internationaux, et nous avons analysé les dettes de l'Équateur à l'égard d'autres pays, à l'égard de la France, du Japon, de l'Allemagne, et enfin les dettes intérieures publiques de l'Équateur.
La pelea por tener acceso a la documentación fue dura, terrible. En el Ministerio de Finanzas, un colaborador nuestro, Alejandro Olmos, hijo, y mi persona, fuimos declarados personas no gratas en el Ministerio de Finanzas y todos los funcionarios del Ministerio de Finanzas hicieron una carta al ministro quejándose y denunciando nuestra posición, tanto de Alejandro Olmos como la mía, que estábamos afectando a los funcionarios del ministerio, ¿no? O sea que nosotros nos reímos de ese hecho, pero para que vea cómo nosotros hemos tenido dificultades serias en este caso y hemos sido acusados de ser los malos de la película, ¿no? En este proceso de auditoría.
Παρά τα εμπόδια, η Επιτροπή κατόρθωσε να ολοκληρώσει το έργο της και διαπίστωσε ότι ένα μεγάλο κομμάτι των χρεών ήταν μη νομιμοποιημένο. Έδωσε τα συμπεράσματά της στο κράτος και το κράτος τα έδωσε στους πολίτες.
En fait, ce qui était très important au niveau de la commission d'audit de l'Équateur, c'est que tous nos travaux ont été rendus publics. Donc la population équatorienne a été largement informée de pourquoi la dette qui avait été contractée par le gouvernement antérieur de l'Équateur, notamment au cours de l'année 2000, était une dette frappée d'illégitimité.
Έχοντας τα στοιχεία από την Επιτροπή, η κυβέρνηση απέδειξε ότι το χρέος είναι μη νομιμοποιημένο και ανακοίνωσε πάυση πληρωμών για το 70% του ομολογιακού χρέους του Ισημερινού.
Frente a esa situación, los tenedores de la deuda ecuatoriana comenzaron a sacar sus bonos al mercado a valores muy bajos, del 20% de su valor. ¿Y qué hizo el Ecuador en forma secreta, no? El gobierno ecuatoriano comenzó a comprar, utilizó unos 800 millones de dólares para comprar 3.000 millones de dólares de deuda. Y fue para el caso ecuatoriano una reducción muy importante de la deuda, que permitió obviamente mejorar las condiciones de vida de la gente.
Il faut aussi, dans l'économie faite par l'Équateur, compter les intérêts qu'il aurait fallu payer jusque 2012 ou 2030. Et si on prend tout en compte, c'était une économie de 7 000 millions, de plus de 7 000 millions de dollars pour l'Équateur. Donc une économie très importante pour le pays, ce qui a permis au gouvernement d'augmenter très fortement les dépenses d'éducation, de santé, pour la création d'emplois aussi, pour l'amélioration des infrastructures.
Ecuador is no longer in sale, you know?
Hey! 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 Hey!
La ministra del Interior decía: primero vamos a matar a los activistas, a los guerrilleros, después a sus cómplices, después a sus amigos, después a sus familias. Es decir, no vamos a dejar ni el recuerdo de la gente que quiso cambiar algo acá. Bueno, y lo que trataron de hacer, ¿no? Que hay que entender que el terror de la dictadura no termina con los juicios a los militares de Alfonsín. Hay toda una generación que quedó absolutamente aterrorizada. Yo me acuerdo porque era muy joven en esa época. La sensación de que por repartir 4 panfletos y luchar por 2 demandas te podían torturar 6 años seguidos. Es decir, que el terror fue la forma predominante y fundamental de dominio político del neoliberalismo. El neoliberalismo en Argentina no funciona sino por una vía de producción de consenso muy específica, que es el miedo, es el terror.
Up until the sort of December crisis, or maybe a few months before, Argentina was the poster child of the IMF.
Grandes sectores de las clases medias vivieron muy felices con el dólar barato y viajaron por todo el mundo y consumían como en el primer mundo, mientras entre 10 y 12 millones de personas se caían de toda capacidad de consumo, de toda capacidad mínima de vida digna y decidieron no mirar, no conocer nada, ¿no?
Hace 8 meses desocupado. Trabajaba en una fábrica. Cerró y se fue del país.
Yo hace 3 años que estoy sin trabajo y bueno, antes trabajaba de chofer. Tenía
2 años sin trabajar. Yo era colectivero.
El mío yo trabajaba en recolección de basura y me quedé sin trabajo hace 2 años.
Estamos en Argentina, por eso nos quedamos todos sin trabajo.
En cada uno de ustedes vive uno de los 30.000, o 10 o 20 o 30 de los 30.000, que tenemos que pelear para que no mueran más niños, pero que no sea una cosa de lástima, que sea verdad. No puede ser que en este país se mueran 100 niños, no puede ser por día, no lo podemos permitir. Tenemos que acompañar todas las luchas, tenemos que sentir, compañero, de una vez por todas, que el otro soy yo. El otro soy yo, 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 el piquetero soy yo, el revolucionario soy yo, los que toman la fábrica soy yo, los que no comen soy yo, todos somos yo.
Hay milonga de amor, hay temblor de gotán.
On the 1st of January, we chose to die fighting rather than to die forgotten. We armed our voice so that it could be heard. We hid our face so that it could be seen. We spoke with fire, and with fire responded the powerful. But then other voices spoke.
For over 75 years, the PRI ruled Mexico with violence and fraud. Every generation rose up against them and every generation was crushed. But when the Zapatistas appeared in 1994, the entire country mobilized around them. In 7 years of struggle, Mexico moved from dictatorship to a media-driven democracy, and in 2001, the PRI was forced to give up the presidency. The country celebrated the defeat of the PRI and hoped for peace. The guerrilla army put aside their weapons and marched on the capital, asking the new government to pass the peace accords that the PRI had vetoed.
Tú no tienes la culpa, mi amor, que el mundo sea tan feo.
Ni uno solo de los candidatos había tenido tal cantidad de gente que por su propio gusto y su propia convicción fuera a ver a alguien. Todos esos que no le dicen nada a los partidos políticos, toda esa gente que aunque haya votado tal vez por Fox para quitar al PRI, pero quiere otro México más justo, más digno, todos esos están sintiendo la fuerza que tienen, porque no es lo mismo salir tú solo a la plaza o emitir tu voto a salir rodeado de miles más que piensan como tú, que quieren otro México.
In 7 years, we moved Mexico from dictatorship to representative democracy, and in 2 weeks that spring, we came through representative democracy and out the other side. The time to dialogue with the world of power has passed in Mexico.
아직 어둠에 쌓여있는 국회.
1996년 12월 26일 국회에서 노동자들의 생존권과 민주적 권리를 무시한 노동학법이 날치기로 통과되었다. 신한국당이 날치기를 해서라도 노동법을 개혁하려고 했던 것은 전 세계 자본의 흐름을 쫓아가기 위해서다.
Bai Del Ho spent his life in the factory. Over 2 decades, he built a family and a home and some dignity there. But when the IMF came to privatize the industry, he struck with his union, and then they took away his job, his home, his bank account, and his children's future. On a Sunday morning in May, he set himself on fire in front of his factory gate. We have seen what the system has done in other countries, and we know what hunger looks like in the street. When we strike today, we are fighting for our lives, for our children's lives, for the lives of those who came before.
민주노동자 총경쟁은 26일 새벽 신한국당이 단독으로 노동법 개혁안을 기습 날치기 통과시킨 반민주적 폭거에 대항 1,200만 노동자들과 온 국민의 분노를 모아 26일 오전부터 산하 전 다이노조에서 즉각 무기한 총파업에 돌입한다.
I'm a victor here, I am the rebel warrior. I have risen along with my head held high. I will only rest when the cause of the oppressed no longer reach the sky. When the sound of the sword of the oppressor no longer rings in battle, hear my war cry. Hey, 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 hear my war cry.
It is interesting to me how this system has continued pretty much the same way for years and years and years, except the economic hitmen have got better and better and better. Then we come up with, very recently, what happened in Venezuela. In 1998, Hugo Chavez gets elected president, following a long line of presidents who had been very corrupt and basically destroyed the economy of the country. And Chavez was elected amidst all that. Chavez stood up to the United States, and he's done it primarily demanding that Venezuelan oil be used to help the Venezuelan people. Well, we didn't like that in the United States. So in 2002, a coup was staged, which there's no question in my mind, and most other people's minds, that the CIA was behind that coup. The way that that coup was fomented was very reflective of what Kermit Roosevelt had done in Iran, of paying people to go out into the streets, to riot, to protest, to say this Chavez is very unpopular. You know, if you can get a few thousand people to do that in television, and can make it look like it's the whole country, and things start to mushroom. Except in the case of Chavez, he was smart enough, and the people were so strongly behind him that they overcame it, which was a phenomenal moment in the history of Latin America.
This is Caracas, capital of Venezuela, one of the richest countries in Latin America, thanks to huge deposits of oil. The rich in Venezuela live in leafy suburbs with names like Country Club. Their spiritual homes are Miami and Washington. The majority live in what are known as barrios, on hillsides in breeze block houses that defy gravity. In the past, these people have been invisible, excluded from their own society. Today, they display the confidence of those who know an extraordinary change has come to their lives. This is Hugo Chavez, president of Venezuela, the voice of the barrios. Chavez and his supporters have won 10 elections in 8 years. He's the symbol of an awakening of people power, driven by great popular movements that are unique to Latin America.
Se acabó el caciquismo de aquellos caudillos adentros, esa falsa democracia de las élites en Venezuela se acabó.
It's no surprise that Chavez, with the help of an aggressive media coverage, has become a hate figure in the United States. Because what he represents is another way, and a threat to American domination.
All right, now, Hugo Chavez, the criminal, speaking of criminal, government of Venezuela, offering... The criminal, it's a criminal government.
In my opinion, in the opinion of a lot of people in our government, Hugo Chavez represents an extreme threat, not only to our nation, but to our hemisphere.
He should have been killed a long time ago. By whom? And anyone who believes other... By anyone.
Hay café por ahí.
Absolutely.
Do you want a cup of coffee?
Yes, yes.
Era una de mis lecciones de inglés de secundaria. Do you want a cup of coffee? Do you want a glass of milk? Do you want a glass of water? English lesson 1. Yo nací en un hogar muy pobre, de campesinos, ¿no? Y me tocó vivir la pobreza. Yo fui un niño pobre, de pie descalzo. Mi padre maestro de escuela, de escuelas rurales, mi madre también. Una abuela hermosa, india, que me llenó de amor. Mi abuela me enseñó mucho y aprendí de ella la solidaridad con los demás, el compartir el pan, aun cuando poco con el otro. Entonces me fui al ejército a la academia militar, me hice soldado y ahí me conseguí con Bolívar. Empecé a dar cuenta de la verdad.
Simon Bolivar is venerated in Latin America as the liberator from Spanish colonialism. Bolivar believed that freedom only came when people united against all invaders, no matter their disguise. Today, the people of Latin America are again rising up against an empire built on an extreme form of capitalism known as the Washington Consensus. Whole countries have been privatized, put up for sale, their natural wealth sold to foreign companies for peanuts. In Venezuela, they've said, no more. Soon after Chavez was elected in 1999, Venezuelans voted on a constitution, and this little blue book has become a bestseller ever since. This is one of a chain of supermarkets set up in the barrios, funded by the proceeds of oil. Here, prices are kept low, and on the back of every rice and soap powder packet are printed people's rights under the Constitution.
Does it really mean something to you to see it there?
No, claro, porque yo no sabía lo de que teníamos derechos como en cualquier otro, pero y en este que nos habla en el artículo número 23, ¿verdad? Que nos habla de la política nacional y legislación. Mira, todo eso es, esto por lo menos nosotros nos instruye.
Democracia, lo dije hace un rato, delante de nuestro pueblo. Como dijo Lincoln, son definiciones sencillas. Ahora, lo difícil es llevarlo a la realidad. Aquí estamos llevándolo a la realidad. Gobierno del pueblo, por el pueblo y para el pueblo. A una sociedad de incluidos y de iguales, donde no haya exclusión, donde no haya miseria, donde reinen los valores humanos.
10 years ago, this clinic would not have been dreamed of. Now, all over Venezuela, ordinary people have free health care, many seeing a doctor for the first time in their lives.
Un documental sobre Venezuela. Perdona la interrupción.
For the first time, children of the poorest have a full day at school and at least one hot meal a day. They're learning history and music and dance, often for the first time, and all of this is free. Under the Constitution, the poorest housewives are now paid as workers.
Desde el mismo nivel y vamos todos, nos preocupamos del compañero que...
There is now close to full literacy thanks to classes like this, catering to those like Mavis Mendez, aged 95, now reading and writing for the first time.
Significa mucho para nosotros. Yo lo único que lamento es que no esté más joven para seguir aprendiendo mucho más.
Porque nunca habíamos tenido un gobierno que se preocupara por la gente pobre, pues. O que lo enseñaran a leer, a escribir, nada de eso.
Pienso que nunca es tarde para superarse uno.
This is East Caracas, home to some of the wealthiest people on earth, and what they call here the middle class. I dropped in on John Vink, who agreed to show me around his grand house.
Wow, this is such a striking house.
Thank you.
My goodness.
Thank you.
Yes. You've been here long, have you? Is this,
yes, I did.
This is the family home?
My family home. We grew up here.
John Vink has travelled the world, collecting objets d'art.
Have you collected all the silverware and chandelier? Is that...
Yes, that one I brought from Spain.
Yeah.
This is a collection of dark blue. That's why I have them over there so they don't break. This is from Peru. It's silver.
But you're thinking of leaving?
Yes. Yes.
Why is that?
Well, the situation of the country. It's getting day by day worse, and
well, in what way? Can you?
In the political way.
Yeah.
We thought that this gentleman that's now in power, that he would change the whole situation, because it was a mess.
Yeah.
But now it's a whole mess.
John Vink's view is echoed by Venezuela's powerful media. Mostly privately owned, it combines banality with hardline anti-Chavez politics.
Al regreso, veremos otros peligros en las nuevas decisiones oficiales.
Que Venezuela se enrumba hacia un régimen muy similar al que impera en la isla de Cuba.
Etcétera. Pero a nivel del gobierno, que es el socialismo del siglo XXI, sencillamente el control total por parte del Estado de la sociedad, pues.
In the old Venezuela, the United States played the part of a mafia godfather. The deal was simple. For supplying endless cheap oil, the Venezuelan rich kept a large slice of the profits. The election of Hugo Chavez ended the deal.
Obviously, Venezuela is important because they're the third largest supplier of petroleum. I would say that Mr. Chavez, and the State Department may say this, probably doesn't have the interests of the United States at heart.
We have been concerned with some of the actions of Venezuelan President Chavez and his understanding of what a democratic system is all about.
Te digo que tratamos aquí de evitar el choque con el imperio, pero era inevitable. Yo fui a Casablanca, le di la mano a Clinton, hasta por teléfono. How are you, Mr. Clinton? How are you, Mr. Chávez? Es decir, nosotros aquí tratamos lo imposible. Hacer una revolución sin chocar con el imperio, imposible.
In Washington and Miami, and the country clubs of Caracas, getting rid of Chavez became an obsession. In early 2002, secret plans were laid by the Venezuelan opposition, with the media leading the attack.
¿Usted cree que el presidente de la República está loco?
Va llegando el momento en que todos hablemos de la transición. Sin Chávez, por supuesto.
Anti-Chavez protesters took to the streets, their anger inflamed by the media.
Nunca ha venido alguien tan feo y tan malo como esto.
Hugo Satanás Chávez Frías es el anticristo, es el demonio, es el diablo, es diantre, Lucifer.
Él es el único que sobra aquí.
The campaign to overthrow Chavez came to a head on April the 11th, 2002. An anti-Chavez protest march was called in the center of Caracas. What they didn't know was that there were two marches that day. The other one was led by Chavez supporters outside the presidential palace, known as Miraflores. The two rallies were supposed to be kept apart, but then an extraordinary series of events unfolded. Without warning, the opposition marchers were redirected to the presidential palace by one of the organizers.
Y él les dice, bueno, vamos hacia el palacio, vamos a desviar la marcha hacia el palacio de Miraflores.
People tried to stop the march from changing course, but the organizer was having none of it.
Le dice, no, en esta vaina mando yo y tú mandas en tu casa. Esto ya está programado y se va hacia Miraflores.
The opposition marchers were suddenly herded towards government supporters. As they approached the palace, shots rang out. They were being fired upon by snipers who shot them one by one, many with a bullet to the head. Soon afterwards, these pictures began appearing on anti-government TV, blaming the shooting on Chavez supporters on a city bridge.
Disparaban y apuntando y descargando las armas automáticas. Bueno, eso queda para la historia, pero gracias a Dios que hay estas evidencias. Y apuntando a la gente que pacíficamente estaba ahí abajo. Esto es una salvajada sin nombre.
¿Eso es lo que llaman revolución?
However, as this camera angle reveals, there were no opposition marchers on the street below the bridge. What the TV pictures did not show was this. The people on the bridge are clearly trying to protect themselves, crouching down to avoid the bullets of unknown snipers above them and anti-Chavez police units below them. The people on the bridge were actually defending themselves.
Entonces era como una zona de combate, de control, y que ellos actuaron bien planificado, estaba súper planificado todo eso.
Within hours, these military chiefs appeared on television. They too blamed Chavez and his supporters for the killings.
Venezolanos, el presidente de la República ha traicionado la confianza de su pueblo. Está masacrando a personas inocentes con francotiradores. Para este momento van 6 muertos y decenas de heridos en Caracas. Esto no lo podemos permitir. No podemos aceptar un tirano en la República de Venezuela.
It was all a setup. The CNN correspondent in Caracas, Otto Neustald, later revealed that the generals had recorded their statement before the shooting.
El día 10 en la noche me llaman por teléfono y me dicen la marcha se va hacia el Palacio de Miraflores, va a haber unos muertos y aparecen 20 militares de alto rango pronunciándose en contra del gobierno de Chávez y pidiendo la renuncia al presidente. En esa prueba ya se habla de muertos cuando todavía no había un solo muerto en la calle y todo sigue como estaba programado.
Soon, the presidential palace was surrounded by renegade army officers. Inside, Hugo Chavez was delivered an ultimatum: resign or be bombed. One of his cabinet ministers broke the news.
Políticamente, que quede en evidencia que esto fue un golpe de Estado. No es que él renunció, pero el presidente no renunció.
Okay.
No renunció y entonces va preso, porque es un golpe de Estado.
Okay.
¿Qué?
Que lo sepa el mundo.
Que lo sepa el mundo.
The plotters announced that Chavez had resigned. He hadn't. He was kidnapped. The following morning, an unelected dictator was sworn in. He was a leading businessman called Pedro Carmona.
Eso hicieron una fiesta. Yo vi todo ese programa cuando ellos estaban en tu programa de televisor. Mire, mijo, usted no tiene idea cómo lloré. Como que si se habían muerto mis hijos y mi madre, que son la cosa más sagrada que tengo. En verlo a ellos, como decían, bueno, amaneció de nuevo en Venezuela.
In one amazing proclamation, democracy was demolished, piece by piece.
Se suspende de sus cargos a los diputados principales y suplentes a la Asamblea Nacional. Se destituyen de sus cargos ilegítimamente ocupados al presidente y demás magistrados del Tribunal Supremo de Justicia. Así como al fiscal general de la República, al Contralor General de la República, al defensor del pueblo, y a los miembros del Consejo Nacional Electoral.
Usted no tiene idea de lo que ese decreto nos hizo. Fue tan fuerte la cuestión, lo que nosotros vivimos en ese momento, porque ya no veíamos al pasado, a la represión, a la lucha por todo.
In the United States, the broadcast media carried the same pictures and the same story used to justify the coup.
The Bush administration made it clear it is happy with a change in leadership in the country responsible for 15% of America's oil imports. Anthony Mason has our report.
In the end, this is what triggered the overthrow of Hugo Chavez. Armed gangs loyal to the Venezuelan president firing on thousands of anti-government protesters. After 16 people were killed and hundreds wounded, last night soldiers surrounded the presidential palace.
At the White House, the spokesman of President Bush rubber-stamped the story.
Let me share with you the administration's thoughts about what's taking place in Venezuela. We know that the action encouraged by the Chavez government provoked this crisis. The Chavez government suppressed peaceful demonstrations, fired on unarmed, peaceful protesters, resulting in 10 killed and 100 wounded. That is what took place, and a transitional civilian government has been installed.
Back in Venezuela, 3 years of modest democratic reform had been overturned.
Afortunadamente tenemos una gran arma, que son los medios de comunicación. Si ustedes, el pueblo venezolano vio hoy, el ejército ni la Fuerza Armada hizo un disparo. Todo esto fue nuestras armas fueron los medios de comunicación.
The plotters and their friends had everything to celebrate, or so they thought. The next morning, distraught people began phoning one of the independent radio stations still broadcasting.
Que tanto nos ha costado a los venezolanos. Me duele el alma por mi hijo, por mi hija, por los nietos, por toda esta juventud que va a quedar a la deriva de nuevo, en las manos de los adecos y los copellanos corruptos que llevaron a este país al caos total, sin moral.
Se fue la esperanza de un pueblo, se fue la Constitución. Se fue la democracia, se fue la esperanza de los niños.
But hope had not gone. The truth began to emerge that the resignation of Hugo Chavez had been faked. His wife, Maria, confirmed this in a call to the radio station.
Me dijo, aún después de muerto, quiero que logres que los organismos internacionales le hagan una prueba de grafología a esa firma, si es que existe, porque yo nunca firmé eso.
And the people in the barrios started to fight back. Down from the shanties they came to rescue their president.
The farther you take my rights away, the faster I will run. You can deny me, you can decide to turn your face away.
Queremos a Chávez. Chávez es el presidente de Venezuela y el pueblo lo ama y lo vamos a defender.
No matter, 'cause there's something inside so strong. I know that I can make it, though you're doing me wrong, so wrong. You thought that my pride was gone. Oh no, something inside so strong.
Hundreds of thousands surrounded the palace, demanding the return of Chavez. Faced by such people power, the army turned.
Es que, desde el punto de vista militar, toda la Fuerza Armada, el 98% de la Fuerza Armada en todo el país, ha reafirmado, ha reiterado su lealtad a la Constitución vigente en Venezuela, a la Constitución de la República Bolivariana de Venezuela.
Roared on by huge crowds, the presidential guard who had gone into hiding retook the palace, and the plotters fled.
Los muchachos, los policías militares que estaban dentro de Miraflores, empezaron a levantar la bandera. Eso también nos dio más fuerza todavía a que no estábamos solos. Y ahí nos quedamos hasta que empezó a venir un helicóptero. Venía un helicóptero a medianoche que llegó a Miraflores y ahí sabíamos que venía Chávez. Eso fueron una hora de gloria para nosotros en vez que llegaba.
Just 48 hours after being kidnapped, Chávez was back in power.
Creo que la prueba suprema fue el golpe de Estado de abril 2002. Fui hecho prisionero, me llevaron, pensé que iba a morir. Ahora el pueblo venezolano, los pobres, sin armas, se fueron por cientos de miles a las calles, por millones, a pedir por mi vida y a pedir que vuelva Chávez. Entonces a mí no me queda más nada, después de eso sobre todo, que dedicarle todo lo que me quede de vida a ese pueblo, sobre todo a los más necesitados, sobre todo a los más pobres.
As ordinary Venezuelans celebrated the defense of their democracy, some of the leading plotters fled to Miami, and within days it was clear that Washington had cast its shadow over the failed coup. The Bush administration had gone along with the lies of the plotters.
We know that the action encouraged by the Chavez government provoked this crisis.
As these CIA documents show, it was fully warned and knew all about their conspiracy. Washington claims that it warned Chavez about the coup. This is denied by the Venezuelan government. Washington not only knew what was going on, it was backing and funding the coup indirectly. Documents recently released show that the Bush administration channeled millions of dollars to the Venezuelan opposition in the months leading up to the coup. The money was handed out by its principal aid agency, USAID, and an organization called the National Endowment for Democracy.
During the 6-month period prior to the coup in April 2002, the U.S. government invested more than $2 million into financing these organizations that they knew at least 6 months before were planning to overthrow the government.
You're essentially saying post hoc ergo propter hoc, because it happened after.
I don't think our viewers will understand that. If you could translate that.
Just because it happened after we provided support to these groups doesn't mean that it happened because we provided support to these groups. Yeah. It is a logical fallacy. Right. We would be very open and transparent about what kind of support we provided through the National Endowment for Democracy and other institutions.
In fact, the National Endowment for Democracy handed out money to groups whose leaders were given cabinet positions in the short-lived illegal regime. An official in Washington explained that this was merely part of President Bush's freedom agenda.
But I want to just be very explicit about this, because there is, I think it's very important, and it's in the interest of fairness, to understand that the United States did not support that coup.
This is Bolivia, another laboratory experiment. The majority of the population of this spectacular, brutalized country high in the Andes have also been invisible until recently. The indigenous people, the Aymara and Quechua, carry memories of a culture and civilization and wealth long before the Spanish arrived 500 years ago. They remember how a single hill of silver underwrote the entire Spanish Empire, while they became the poorest. This is the National Congress of Bolivia. Until recently, the faces here were almost all white, the descendants of a tiny Spanish elite which plundered the nation's riches and reduced the indigenous majority to serfdom. It was a pattern of control repeated all over Latin America. The pattern has been broken in Bolivia with the rise of social justice movements of a kind never seen before, and whose democratic home is not Westminster or Washington or any other so-called model, but in the streets, the mines, the barrios, the fields. Governments that defy this popular power, this true democracy, do so at their own peril. This is El Alto, the highest city on earth, and perhaps the poorest. The occupants of this cemetery on the roof of the world are mainly children. Protected, they say, by the sacred mountain Illimani, El Alto overlooks Bolivia's capital, La Paz. Juan Delfin, a priest and a taxi driver, has lived here for most of his life.
Esta es una zona Villa Ingenio, cementerio general de Villa Ingenio, de la zona norte, de la ciudad del Alto. Y aquí hay una triste amargura. Hay de todo tipo que están nuestros hermanos, nuestros niños, nuestras hijas, nuestros abuelos y abuelas muertos que están simplemente enterrados. Vemos lo que está, ¿no? Hay incluso una familia, se envenenó toda la familia por falta de trabajo, por falta de economía. Primero el esposo lo envenenó a su esposa, a sus hijos, y él también se envenenó. Hay casos que hemos visto así.
When I first came to Bolivia in the 1960s, El Alto barely existed. The million people living here are peasants run off their land and miners made redundant by policies similar to those imposed in Chile. Infrastructure that didn't make a quick buck was privatized. The message was clear: sell it, strip it, or scrap it. The indigenous people were scrapped.
¿Por qué? Nos preguntamos. Si yo era rico, si soy boliviano rico y nacido, pero ¿por qué estoy pidiendo la limosna? ¿Por qué? Si teníamos mar por un lado, ¿no? Si teníamos plata, oro, todo teníamos. Entonces, ¿por qué seguimos sufriendo?
In the year 2000, the people of Bolivia's second city, Cochabamba, fought an epic struggle to win back their most basic resource, water, from a foreign consortium dominated by the American corporation Bechtel. And they won. Three years later, in 2003, Bolivia's power brokers were about to get another shock. This is Gonzalo Sanchez de Lozada. Known as Goni, he was brought up in Washington. His English is better than his Spanish. They knew him here as El Gringo.
Yo lo veía un gordo sentado en una silla de ruedas, que es de oro, ¿no? Y soberbio. Entonces yo pienso que él era soberbio, tal vez por el poder que tenía, ¿no? Que era su riqueza.
When Goni was elected president of Bolivia in 2003, he backed a law that amounted to a fire sale of the country's resources. Almost everything was up for grabs. including Latin America's second biggest gas reserves.
De un de repente sabemos que tenemos gas y se está vendiendo al otro extranjero y tiene que ir a Estados Unidos, tan grandes, y mientras yo me estoy cocinando con leña. Entonces empieza la guerra desde ahí. Bloqueamos, manifestamos y paro hasta que nos responda.
The people of El Alto fought back, blocking the roads leading into La Paz.
Se bloquee, que no se deje, que no vuele una mosca, decían. La gente ya salía a bloquear y no dejamos pasar las movilidades, ¿no? Pero eso se ha ido ya, ¿cómo se dice? Intensificando.
Gurney's response was the traditional Latin American way. He sent in the army to crush dissent. Scores were shot dead. Tens of thousands of people poured down into La Paz, like the people of Venezuela's barrios demanding the return of their president. They demanded their country back. If the rich and powerful of Latin America had a nightmare, this was it.
De pronto se sabía que el gobierno iba a renunciar. Peor con eso. Hemos agarrado como si fuera algo, un ánimo para que él se vaya. La meta era eso, para sacarlo a él. Eso era la meta.
Gurney fled to the United States and is today living in a smart suburb of Washington. In October 2004, the Bolivian Congress ordered his arrest on charges of bloody massacre. George Bush has said, governments that harbor terrorists are as guilty as they are.
Pero toda esta oscuridad estamos así. El oscuro que nos ve. Toda la oscuridad.
This extraordinary mural was painted by Juan Delfin. It's a cry of freedom from an entire continent.
Todo mataron, pero nosotros defendemos este pueblo aymara con el pututo que defendemos nosotros, con la expresión de la voz, con el puño que tenemos y que manejamos nuestra bandera, que es nuestra huipala, la bandera, contra Estados Unidos. Este es Estados Unidos, la bandera de Estados Unidos. Contra eso estamos nosotros, porque ellos nos han hecho esto así. Es puño muy importante. Por eso cuando juramos, sí, esto es nuestro, y estamos así.
In 2005, the people of Bolivia took an historic step. For the first time ever, an indigenous person was voted president in a landslide. Like Chavez in Venezuela, Evo Morales offered a new democracy and a new beginning.
Quisiéramos que todos empecemos a trabajar. Se acabó las fiestas, se acabó la luna de miel, ahora es trabajo permanente para cambiar nuestra Bolivia.
Sin duda que está creciendo, se está propagando por todo el continente de América Latina, el Caribe, pero sobre todo en Sudamérica. Yo me la paso recorriendo esta América Latina desde Buenos Aires hasta Brasilia, Montevideo, La Paz, y por todos lados hay un fervor desatado, hay un fervor.
In Latin America, there's now a host of leaders offering new beginnings. Of course, history is crowded with heroes who offer new beginnings. The respectability of great power and its games and deals and plunder always beckon. If these new leaders succumb, their biggest threat may not be from Washington, but from the people on the hillsides.
Open your eyes, time to wake up. Enough is enough, is enough, is enough. Open your eyes, time to wake up. Enough is enough, is enough, is enough. Man a gunshot. Enough is enough, is enough. Give the fascist man a gunshot. Trying again to get this damn thing done. It can't done. Come shoot the fascists with a gun. Cause it's stopping us from unity. We cannot see reality, just vanity, insanity. Fusion cannot stand it, see. No man, fascist man will ever get me out of the land. So understand, fusion plan to stop them with a bang. We sang and sang to make the people all unite. Not fight, but fight because the leaders don't think right. You built us in the past, you know it won't happen again. So black and white, take a stand and I'll try to defend all of the people and the children who are living in the past. Just blast and blast, no make the fascist man last. Open your eyes, time to wake up. Enough is enough, is enough, is enough. Open your eyes, time to wake up. Enough is enough, is enough, is enough. Enough is enough, is enough. Give the fascist man a gunshot. Enough is enough, is enough. Give the fascist man a gunshot. On and on and on, you know they feeling so strong. So long, it's wrong, I'm telling you it's wrong. Distraction, confusion, and blaming it on the color. I wonder, in horror, cause the people start to follow. All the leaders and the rulers who are putting up defense. It's tense, immense, and you say you're talking sense. Bull, I want to say it full. But people on the video, you know will make a fool. So I try to tone it down to make the whole world know that the language of my violence will proceed in my show. Flow to make the fascist man know that unity is here and unity will grow. Open your eyes, time to wake up. Enough is enough, is enough, is enough. Open your eyes, time to wake up. Enough is enough, is enough, is enough. Enough is enough, is enough, is enough. Open your eyes, time to wake up. Enough is enough, is enough, is enough.